Hey everybody, this is Jason. I'm back with another video. Today we are going to learn Rollup, which is an awesome new build tool. I don't know how new it is. I just found out about it. I think it's awesome. So we're going to be working with that today. It's an alternative to if you've used webpack or Browserify. It also can fill the space that build tools like Grunt and Gulp do to a limited extent. I'm particularly excited about Rollup after seeing an article about the cost of loading lots of modules. So Rollup is built with that in mind. It's specifically designed for bundling ES6, ES2015 modules. And the benefit of doing it that way is that it does something called tree shaking. When you load a module, so if you bring in a package like jQuery, Lodash, any of these big utility libraries out there, if you only use one or two functions, you end up bundling with Webpack or Browserify all of the code that comes with that. So for something where you're only using one function and you end up importing 50, that's a lot of bloat in your final bundle that is extra stuff that people have to download onto their device. So what tree shaking does, which is this ES6 module, it's what Rollup is particularly good at, is it only imports the code that you're actually using. So if a module has 8 functions in it and you only use one of them, the final bundle will only use the one function that was referenced by your code. This results in vastly smaller bundles and a much smaller file to load for your users, which is overall a big win. So today we're going to start the first of a 3-part series. Part 1 is going to be on JavaScript itself. So we're going to set up Rollup. We're going to get it bundling our modules. We're also going to make sure that we can use it with future syntax. So we'll get Babel hooked up in there. We're going to use some third-party node packages. So we want to make sure that we can actually load. Even if a package is not ES6, ES2015, we still want to be able to load it. So we're going to put in some plugins to handle node packages that are written with CommonJS, which is the module.export style of module. We'll also put in a linter, and we will put in some uglification to compress and minify the file. In part 2, we're going to go a step further and do our style sheets through Rollup using a post-CSS plugin. And that'll allow us to use some future-facing CSS syntax, things like the color function and variables. And we'll also be able to directly inject those into the head, which regardless of whether or not that's actually a good idea, I talk a little bit about that in the video itself. We're going to do it for this particular walkthrough. Finally, in part 3, we're going to automate the whole system so that you are able to just fire one command and have it watch and reload whenever a change is made instead of having to manually recreate your bundle. By the end of this tutorial, you're going to have a running build system for getting your JavaScript and your styles into your web project automatically compressed, processed, future-proofed, and we're going to do all of this in under an hour total for all the videos. So part 1 today, we're going to do it in about 30 minutes to get your JavaScript up and running. So let's jump in. Today, what we want to do is we're going to build some front-end automation. We're going to compile our JavaScript using Rollup, which is a competitor to, say, Webpack or Browserify, things like that. And the reason that we're using it is because Rollup is just kind of inherently faster when you're using ES2015 modules, which are the ones that use import and export as opposed to, say, module.exports, which would be the CommonJS style, or other types of modules out there. There's some really technical stuff behind this. I would encourage you to read the Rollup documentation to get a more of a technical overview of why it's more efficient. Today, we're just interested in getting up and running, and we're going to try to do that as quickly as possible. So to get started, we're going to be using just a small demo project that I put together. It's on GitHub, and you can clone it with this command, which just pulls one branch, the step0 branch, and it'll drop it into a learn rollup folder. So let's jump into that folder, and we'll just pull it up in Sublime so that we can take a look. And you can see here that we've got a simple JavaScript file Now, this just imports a couple modules, it runs functions from each of those modules, and then outputs that into an element with a class name of debug output. That element lives in this index file. Now, I know I put the index file in this build folder, which I actually wouldn't recommend, but because this is about bundling scripts and styles and not about dealing with HTML, I'm skipping a step. So in production, I would definitely recommend have a step to copy your index file over. But for this demo, we're just going to assume that that step is already done. Bad practice. Don't do that in a real project. So inside this file, this is the only part that's really important. We've got this output, debug output class on this code tag. That's where the JavaScript is going to print. And this is where we'll ultimately want that bundle to live, is in the build folder in a JavaScript or a JS subfolder called main.min.js. So that's what we're aiming for when we're using Rollup. And you can see up here, nothing special is going on. We're not including any styles or no external JavaScripts loaded, anything like that. This is just the bare bones template to get that going. And if we open this in our browser, let's get a Chrome tab up here. That's the wrong place for it. Let's move over into a better desktop. Here we go. If we take this and we want to go to, can I do this from memory? Let's see. Users, J. Langsdorf, demo, learn rollup, build index.html. Oh shit! First try. That's awesome. Okay, let's. So as you're looking at this, you know, there's nothing special going on. We've got this pre-tag is here, but nothing's happening with it yet. And if we look into the console, we'll see that our main.min.js is not actually existing yet. So what that means is we need to actually install something. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to be putting everything into our package.json. Because these are all development dependencies, we are going to be installing them as development dependencies. So the first one that we want to install is Rollup itself. So we do npm install dev, or save dev rollup, and that'll give us the ability to actually use it. And so what we're going to do just to start is we're going to create a file called rollup.config.js. So inside this rollup.config.js, what we need to do is tell it what we want it to do. So we're going to use ES15 modules, so export default, and we're going to export an object. And what we need to start out with is our entry, which is going to be source scripts and main.js, and our destination, and that destination is going to be build.js main.min.js. Okay, now the next thing that we need is what format it's going to be. And what we're using here, since this is going to go into the browser, is what's called an immediately invoked function expression called an IFI. You have probably seen these before. We'll talk about them a little bit once we see the output here. And then we also want to make sure that we are generating a source map, which we want to be inline. And that's it for now. So let's save that. And then what we can do is let's move over to our terminal here, and we can run this. And we're going to do this kind of the hard way. So let's go in, and we're going into our node modules folder, and then this .bin is the binaries, and getting the rollup command. And then -c tells it to look for that rollup.config.js. So let's run that. And now it's run, so that means we have a JS folder and everything is done. Now if you look here, this up at the top, this first line, and all the way at the bottom, this bottom line, that's what's called the IFI, the immediately invoked function expression. And what that does is it effectively encapsulates everything inside this script to its own scope, and that helps prevent us from polluting the window global or doing anything that might interfere with third-party scripts. It also hopefully protects us a little bit from other scripts that may have interfered a little bit with the global scope. So what's really cool about this is that right out of the box, with almost no configuration, we have just created a bundle that's actually super simple to read, which if you've ever tried to read the output of something like Webpack or Browserify, it's not that simple. So what we've got here is that everything that was in our original script is here now. And we can see that where it was importing, those import commands have actually been removed, and the contents of the imports are just inserted right here above. Now this is great because one of the things that that's a bummer about the ES6 modules or the ES 2015 modules is that they're not currently supported by any browser. There's been some disagreement on how to make that actually work. So the spec is finalized, but we're not actually able to use it yet. So what Rollup does is it allows us to use that syntax now and then bundles these scripts. And something else interesting happened here because if you look, we've got this say hello to function, but in our module, this module actually came with another function called say goodbye to. And when we look at the output here, that say goodbye to isn't included anywhere. Now that's the most beneficial part of using Rollup because in something like webpack, that whole module would have been included. The say hello to and the say goodbye to functions both would have been exported with the webpack bundle. And that adds a lot of bloat, especially when you start using third-party modules. You know, if you're loading jQuery or Lodash or underscore or something like that, there are a ton of things that are included in that library. And if you only use one or two things, say you're using jQuery just to have access to the Ajax helper, you're also loading everything else that jQuery does into your bundle. And that can add a lot of bloat and a lot of extra file size to your bundles. And that's what, so what this is called tree shaking. And tree shaking is in the simplest sense, the removal of unused script. So when we load in main.js, we load say hello to. This means we're only getting one of the exported functions. And because of that, when Rollup looks, it realizes say goodbye to is never actually called anywhere in the code. And as a result, it drops it entirely. So that's a huge optimization and a huge advantage over using something like Webpack or Browserify, for example. Now, depending on what type of JavaScript you're writing, this may be all you need. But for most of us, especially if we're using the future-facing ES 2015, ES 2016 syntax, we're going to need a little bit more. We have things here like these are some templates, and down here I'm using fat arrow functions, and unfortunately these won't work in older browsers. So we need to use something to make it work. Fortunately, Rollup is compatible with Babel, so we can use Babel to just transpile our ES 2015-2016 into ES5, which will work all the way back to IE9, or with a polyfill, we can get it to work back to IE8, IE6, whatever we need. So let's get Babel installed, and that'll allow us to transpile this, and it's fortunately super easy. So again, we're going to npm install save dev, and Rollup has all of its plugins prefixed as Rollup plugin. So we're going to install Rollup plugin Babel. And once we've done that, great. Now we can go back to our rollup.config.js, and at the top, let's have our plugins. So we're going to do import Babel from Rollup plugin Babel. And down here, we're going to create an array called plugins, and that will be where we keep our actual plugin calls. Now, Babel needs one configuration option, which is an excludes, and we're going to have it exclude the node modules, anything in node modules, because we don't want that to be, you shouldn't transpile somebody else's code. So let's leave all the third-party modules out of it. And we can do that. And that's really all there is to it. So let's get back over to the terminal, and we're going to run Rollup again. And I broke it. What broke? I forgot my Babel RC. That's important. So let's go in here. We're going to create a new file, and we're going to call it Babel RC. And inside, this is a JSON file, and we need to use the ES 2015 Rollup preset. And we haven't installed that yet, so let's install it. npm install save dev Babel preset ES 2015 Rollup. Okay, so we've done that. Our Babel RC is saved. So now let's go ahead and get this run. And I broke it again. Now what broke? That's what it was. It's exclude, not excludes. Okay, so that worked. Now, if we look at our main.min.js, we can see this function that used to be a fat arrow function is no longer a fat arrow function. And this that used to be a template string has been converted into a regular string. So with just a couple lines of configuration, now we don't have to worry about our JavaScript breaking in older browsers, but we get to continue writing it in whatever we want. You know, I get to keep my template strings, and Babel and Rollup will take care of that for me so that I don't need to stress about it. Super handy. So next, what we want to do is we want to use a linter. And if you're not using linters now, that's something that I would highly recommend you start doing. The reason is that a linter, something like ESLint, JSHint, JSLint, something like that, all of those will go through your code and parse it and find normal issues. So if you have a style guide, say you always require semicolons or you disallow semicolons and you're not supposed to use them, in all of those cases, it's really useful to catch those early. Things like undefined variables, things like that. You want to get that soon, because if you don't, if you miss a closing parentheses or you're missing a comma or a semicolon, that's the kind of bug that can take hours to hunt down. You just don't see it, you let it go, you're poring over it looking for anything that could be wrong, and before you know it, you spent 2 hours looking for a bug that ended up being a missing fucking semicolon. And we don't want that. So let's use a linter. The linter helps spot those issues immediately. To do that, let's clear this. We're going to now install a new plugin, so save dev, and it's going to be Rollup plugin ESLint. And once we've installed ESLint, we actually need to configure it as well, because we want to tell it what rules we want to follow. So I'm going to get in here and run ESLint init. Now again, I'm going into the node modules folder and into the binaries and running ESLint. You can also install it globally if you want. That's easier for some people. For me, I always forget what I've installed globally, so I like to make sure it's on a per package as opposed to me like multiply installing things and guessing and hoping that it works. So now we install, and it's going to give us some options here. I'm going to use the option to answer some questions, and I am using ES6 features, so I hit yes. I am using ES6 modules, so yes. My code is running in the browser. I'm not using CommonJS. I'm not using JSX. I will be using spaces, and we're using single quotes with Unix style line breaks, and I do like to have semicolons. So let's put it out as JSON. And now this is almost right, but there's a couple things that I want to change. So let's go in and let's open this file that was just generated. And we can see it configured all this for us, saves us a bunch of time. Now the thing that I want to change, I don't like the 4 spaces. I want to have 2 spaces. And the other thing that we need is later on, we're going to be working with a global. And I want to define that now so we don't have to come back to it later. So I'm going to create a global variable called env, and we're just going to define that so that ESLint doesn't complain when it finds it in our code later. So now that we've saved that, we can go back into our config and we can set that up. So in rollup.config.js, let's import ESLint from Rollup plugin ESLint, and down here underneath Babel, we will run ESLint, or actually we want to run this before Babel. So let's ESLint, and let's just see what happens. I know we're going to have a problem, but I want to talk about this real quick. So let's run Rollup, and we got an issue. What was our issue? Cannot read the config file because I bet I typoed in it. Let's look. Yep. Can't put trailing commas in JSON, which is a bad habit of mine from writing JavaScript. So let's run that again. Okay, and it just read it, and everything is good. So I thought we were going to have a problem, but the reason it didn't happen is because we're not to the style part yet. So let's just go ahead and actually add this configuration because we're going to need it later. We don't want ESLint to run on our style sheet, so we're going to exclude our style sheet. Oops. So none of our styles are actually going to be parsed by ESLint because that wouldn't make any sense. So now we can run that again just to make sure I didn't break anything. Okay, all good. Now, it didn't do anything yet, which is right because, I mean, obviously I write flawless code. But let's break something. So let's get rid of this, the semicolon. And now we can see that in main.js, line 6, column 36, we're missing a semicolon. So we can go in, we're in main.js, column 6, line 36, missing semicolon. So it makes it so much easier to catch silly, stupid bugs in our code that might hang us up for minutes or hours in other cases. So once we fix that, obviously, run it again, we're all good, no problems. And our output here, still all good. So at this point, we've got the basics figured out. We've got our code is being bundled appropriately. We're bringing in our modules, and we're running it through a linter, and we're using Babel to transpile it to make sure that what we get is you know, functional in other browsers except the latest ones. You know, we want it to run in older versions of IE, things like that. But at this point, we haven't addressed one of the biggest problems, which is that third-party libraries may not support the ES6 modules. So at some point, we may want to include a third-party module into our script. For example, for debugging, I really like this tool, and this one would be used in production, so we're actually going to do regular save, and it's called debug. And what I like about debug is that it is it's a way to do console logging that can be turned on or off depending on who's using it. So you can turn it on in the browser using your console, or you can turn it on programmatically, which is what I like to do based on environment variables, which we'll get to a little bit later on. But for now, let's just include it. And so we're going to create a debugger, and we're going to import debug from debug, and we're going to create a log function, a log object that is app log. Okay, and from that, then we want to enable debug, and this just enables everything. Debug has a lot of features that I'm not touching on, so bear with me here. And then we're just going to let people know that logging is enabled. Very simple, very cool. We can just, you know, this does a lot of cool things for us. It allows us to log from all of our modules. It makes it easier to trace problems. However, because it's a node module, it's set up as common.js. And if I go to compile, it gives me this complaint. It's treating debug as an external dependency, and there's nothing provided, so it's just guessing. That's never a good thing. And if we look into main.min.js, there's nothing happening. It's assuming that debug will be passed in from the global, from the window. That's a bad idea. So if we try to actually run this, debug is not defined. So that's no good. So what we need to do to solve that problem is we need to install another couple of plugins. The first one is one that will load node plugins or node packages from the node modules directory. That one's called Rollup plugin node resolve. And then we need another one that can transpile common.js to ES 2015, which will allow Rollup to actually use it without choking. So let's install those. npm install save dev, and it's going to be rollup plugin node resolve and rollup plugin common.js. And once these get installed, we're going to go back into our rollup.config.js and we're going to tweak this configuration. Okay, so first we need to import these. So we're going to import resolve from rollup plugin node resolve, and we're going to import common.js from rollup plugin common.js. Then down here, we'll put it up at the top. We're going to do resolve, and this one needs some configuration. So what we need here is, in order to try to ease the transition between common.js, which is the predominant Node.js module system, and the ES 2015 modules, they've proposed a JS Next. So this probably won't affect most packages, but packages that are trying to ease the transition to ES 2015 modules may have a JS Next defined in their package.json, which is a good idea. If you are a Node package maintainer, it would be a good idea to check this out because it'll make things a lot easier for people who are trying to unify the worlds of Node.js and front-end JS. Next, we want to do main, which means that the resolve is going to look for the main file, even if it's common.js. And finally, if they do define a browser version of the files, we want that because we are compiling for the browser. And after that, we just need to run the common.js plugin so that we actually get our common.js modules included in the bundle without choking Rollup. So let's get that saved. Now we'll go in here, we'll run Rollup, and if I got it all right, looks like no typos this time, in main.min.js, we now have, you can see here, this is all of the stuff that debug includes. We won't go into what it does, but basically it just adds a lot of helpers. And up here we also saw common.js here. Create common.js module, which helps us get into the Node modules. So let's see, we got that run, so let's just refresh. And now we can see our logger worked. So this is awesome. We got exactly what we wanted. And now we can use Node.js packages in a browser context, assuming that the package, of course, supports the browser context. Not all of them are going to work. But this will make things a lot easier when we're building our packages because we can use the tools that help us avoid reinventing the wheel. So while our logger is great, we don't want that to work in production. And so one of the things that I like about debug is that it doesn't require us to strip out console log. It allows us to just disable it in production mode. So let's actually just go in here and let's do that. So we're going to disable logging in production. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to check this environment variable. Remember, we defined that in the ESLint JSON. So if that's not production, then we want to do this. Otherwise, we're going to disable debug. Okay, so this, in theory, is great. But obviously, if we run it, it's going to break. And the reason is that we never defined that end variable anywhere. And so with production or with environment variables, what you do in Node is you would just define it before you called the script, and that would work. Unfortunately, because this is the browser, this only is showing up in the rollup command, so that bundle that gets output doesn't actually have access to this environment variable. So instead, what we have to do is write a replacer, or there are lots of ways to get around this. The way that we're going to get around it is we're going to use a replacer plugin, and then we can access the Node environment variables during the build step to make sure that the right things are accessible, whether we're building for development or production or another environment. So let's do that by installing, save dev, the rollup plugin called replace. And then in our rollup.config.js, we're going to import that. Rollup plugin replace. And all the way down at the bottom here, we're going to run replace. And the first argument is what we want to replace. And the second argument is what we want to replace it with. So we want to make sure that it's actually encapsulated, because if you look here, this is just, it's a variable. So if we replace that with a string value, say production, that's going to break. So we need to make sure it's wrapped in quotes. So we're going to use JSON stringify for that. And we want to grab the contents of the node.env variable. Now that is the default way to pass environment variables when you're using Node. But if that's not passed, we're going to use this short circuit operator to assign a default value, which will be development. Okay, so with that done, we can save, we can run it, and at first we're going to run it with nothing. Okay, and if we look at the output, we can see that, where is it? If development equals production. So see, it replaced our env variable with the string development, which was our default. So that's perfect. That's exactly what we wanted. And when we reload, we don't get an error. We just get the logger. So now, if I run with node.env equals production, when I look in my main.min.js, it says if production is not production, and see it dropped that code that we're not using, which is great, and it disables it. So when we reload, now we get nothing. So if I clear my console, none of that output. So that is a really handy way to enable environment variables and customize your build based on what you're building it for. So for development, staging, production, whatever. It's very, very easy with Rollup and very easy to keep things kind of under control without having to remember which parts of which files you need to modify. You just set that production variable and things get built the way that you want them to get built. So that is almost the end of it. So the last thing that we want to do before we wrap up the scripts part is we want to install an uglifier. So let's get over here, and we're going to use Uglify.js because that's kind of the de facto standard for the industry, and also it has a Rollup plugin. So let's install that. Save dev, Rollup plugin, Uglify. And now let's go over to rollup.config.js and we'll get it configured. All right, so we start by importing Uglify from Rollup plugin Uglify. And down here is the very last step in our process. Now, normally you would just Uglify and that would be it, right? But we don't actually want to do that because now, I know we have source maps, and I know that this technically isn't necessary, but I want to show another way to do this. So what we're going to do instead of that is we're actually going to check and only Uglify in production. So I'm going to add this little block here, and we're going to do process env node.env equals production and Uglify there. And so what we're doing here is this is basically it's a short circuit operator, which it's kind of like a hacky way to do an if-else statement. And what we're saying is if this returns true, then it automatically fails. We never get to this side. But if this returns false, sorry, then the statement fails, and we never actually run this side of it. But if this returns true, then we run this side, and that will run Uglify. So it's debated as to whether or not that's a good idea. I personally think in this case it's not too unclear, so I'm opting to use it. I think it's kind of a discretionary thing, and it would be something that's probably worth discussing with your team as to whether or not you want to consider it good practice. If you think I'm wrong, leave a comment and tell me why. I'm always open to having a debate about these things. But with that in place, now we can run the rollup, and we're going to run it in production mode because we want that uglifier to work. And we can see now when we go into main.min.js that it's munched. Everything is uglified, minified, compressed. Our variable names have been converted to single letters. You know, anything that will keep this nice and simple for as small as possible. So if we run this without, we can look and let's create a new Finder window. Oh, for fuck's sake, let's just bring it over here. All right. Create a new Finder window, and we'll go into here. There's my demo, and we can look at the build and see that the JS that's built here is about 42 kilobytes, right? So then let's run it in the node env, and when we go back to look at it, it's showing 29 kilobytes. So we lose a pretty good chunk, about 30% of the size, by running that uglify. And obviously, as a file gets bigger, that savings can get more significant depending on how verbose variable names are and how many comments, things like that, are included. So this is kind of a stopping point for us now. And we can see that, with pretty minimal configuration, 34 lines of code, we were able to transpile our code with Babel, combine all of our modules using Rollup's out-of-the-box functionality into a simplified bundle that eliminates dead code using tree shaking. We used Resolve so that we could bring in node packages and CommonJS so that we could include those in our bundle without breaking Rollup. We're using Replace so that we can do environment variables. And finally, we're opting to allow Uglify to work in production so that we can compress the final output of that code. So the next part of this, we're going to jump in and do style sheets, but we're going to call this one for now. All right, guys, that brings us to the end of part one. As of right now, we've got a rollup setup that will combine and bundle up our scripts with all of the processing and fancy crap that we need in order to make it particularly useful in production. In the next video, we are going to jump into processing style sheets in part 2, and since that's pretty short, we'll roll right into part 3 of setting up file watching and automatic reloading of the page whenever you're done. If you like this video, please hit the thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and also if you have ideas for other tutorials, things that you would like to see me work through on camera, go to code.langsdorf.com or hit up the GitHub repository for me. I'm Jay Langsdorf on GitHub. There's a code.langsdorf.com repository. If you've got an idea, open an issue on GitHub and we will get through to them, discuss what would need to be in there, and I'll try to make those. If you like this, again, please like, share, comment, do anything to let me know that you're into these so that I know to keep making them. I really appreciate it, guys, and we'll see you soon. Just hush your mouth. Thanks. Oh, shit. Oh my God, can you do anything quietly?